Hello again, Dan Alasso here, and today I've got for you Chapter 6 of my Ancient and Medieval World History, and I think this one's going to be a little bit shorter than the previous one. I will work that out in the future and try to make them a little bit more even in their length, but today we're going to talk about a period of a few centuries between the classical Greek age and the beginning, really, of almost the Roman Empire. So, here we go. In the last chapter, we discussed a very broad swath of nearly 1,000 years of history. So, as we move forward, the durations are going to be condensed. They're going to become narrower because, really, there's a lot more that we want to consider. In this chapter, we're not going to cover quite 500 years. We will briefly mention a couple of events that I had talked about previously to sort of put them in their context and expand on them a little bit. As we discussed, the idea of the axial age is a little bit vague and covered a very broad time span. And there were a number of additional thinkers, of course, that we did not discuss, and a number of contributions made in the period that we're going to cover this week will extend and elaborate some of these axial ideas. So as we move through this chapter, we'll address some of them as they arise in the chronology. I mentioned also that after the settlement of the Greek hostilities with Persia, jealousy and rivalry between Athens and Sparta erupted into the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BCE. In the first decade of this long war, a Spartan hoplite army invaded Attica, but it was held back by Athens' defenses, especially fortifications that were called the Long Walls, that linked the city with its port of Piraeus. In a second phase of the war, Athens kind of made the mistake of attacking Syracuse, which was an ally of Sparta all the way over in Sicily. And it lost much of its army and almost its entire navy in this ill-considered move. And then with the powerful Athenian navy out of the way, the Persians sensed an opportunity to recover Ionian territory off the coast of Anatolia. And they allied with Sparta against Athens. Persia helped Sparta to build a fleet that ultimately would control the entire Aegean Sea. And Athens ultimately was forced to capitulate in 404 and lost its empire. Sparta imposed an oligarchic regime on Athens and on its allies that were known as the 30 Tyrants. After 10 years, the Athenians did revolt in a lesser-known war called the Corinthian War, from 394 to 386 BCE. And they did regain a measure of their independence, but they never really attained the former glory. A lot has been said about this war, particularly because a history of the war was written by Thucydides, who lived from 460 to 400 BCE, and who was a man who is generally considered to have been the first scientific historian. Thucydides claimed to be impartial, which was different from most of his contemporaries and from previous historians. And he wrote his narrative based on not only his own personal experiences in the war, but also on additional evidence that he gathered. So unlike his contemporaries, and unlike previous historians, Thucydides did not attribute actions or motivations to the interference of gods. Instead, he took what we might call a more politically realistic approach to interpreting events. He called on human nature and fear and self-interest as the main motivations of conflict. Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, ends actually abruptly in 411, before the war itself is over, but the account is continued to the war's end by Xenophon, a younger contemporary of his, in the first book of Xenophon's Hellenica. Xenophon was a Greek who had spent the war fighting as a mercenary for Persia and had, as a result, been exiled from Athens. So his account is considered to be a little bit less impartial than that of Thucydides. A lot has been said about Athenian democracy over the years. And Athenian democracy kind of reached its peak expression about the time of the war, under the leadership of a general and a statesman known as Pericles, who lived from 495 to 429 BCE. During the famous Age of Pericles that began about 461 BCE and ended with his death, Pericles was able to mobilize the demos, or the people of Athens, first in support of ostracizing his main political rival, Cimon, whom he accused of being in league with or somehow aiding Sparta. Now, whether Pericles actually did rule democratically is kind of a complicated question. All eligible citizens could attend the assembly, and a council of 500 and juries that might range from a few men all the way to 500 were selected by random lottery from out of this assembly. But only about 10% of the population were citizens. Only men could participate, of course, and Pericles tightened these restrictions by limiting citizenship only to men whose mothers and fathers had both been citizens. And this actually caused some problems for the sons of Athenian aristocrats who had taken foreign wives. Women and slaves, who made up to 40% of the population, were, of course, excluded. I also mentioned previously that Plato's pupil Aristotle had gone back to his native Macedonia for a while to train the heir of Philip II, the king of Macedonia. The king had turned this northern Greek state into a formidable military power, and the philosopher taught the 13-year-old prince heroic literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey, a little bit of science or proto-science, and ideas about ethics and governance. At 16, after completing 3 years of study with Aristotle, Prince Alexander was called on to govern Macedon when the king was away on military campaigns. And he occasionally campaigned himself. At 18, Alexander led cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, which is the battle that cemented Macedonian control over Greece. Alexander took the throne at age 20 when his father Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE. Greek city-states took the opportunity of Philip's death to revolt, but Alexander crushed rebellions, like the one at Thebes, where he basically razed the city, burned it to the ground in 335 BCE. He then drafted an army from his Greek vassals to support a conquest of the Persian Empire. Alexander was a brilliant general. He never lost a battle. He's considered one of the most skilled strategists and commanders in world history. After taking control of western Anatolia and the Levant at the battles of Granicus in 334 BCE and Issus in 333, Alexander besieged the Phoenicians' island city of Tyre. He used the captured fleets of other Phoenician states, such as Byblos and Sidon, and he also built a half-mile-long or kilometer-long stone causeway that still exists to this day. When he conquered the city, Alexander killed all the men and sold 30,000 women and children into slavery. Alexander then marched through the Levant and advanced into Egypt in 332 and was treated as a liberator. The Egyptians had been under Persian control for about 130 years, so they were happy to crown the Greek king Pharaoh. After visiting the temple of Amun in the Libyan desert and being declared the god's son, Alexander founded a city on the Mediterranean coast that he named after himself. And this was one of 20 or more cities that he would name Alexandria. After his death, this Alexandria would become the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, established by his general and close friend Ptolemy. This kingdom would last 335 years until it was conquered by Rome after its last monarch, the Pharaoh Cleopatra VII, got involved in the Roman Civil War. From Egypt, Alexander marched on Syria and Mesopotamia. After decisively defeating the Persian Emperor Darius III at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander accepted the surrenders of Babylon and Susa and Persepolis without a fight. Alexander campaigned in Bactria and Sogdiana and married the daughter of a Sogdian warlord. Roxana was the first of 3 wives that Alexander married, all for political reasons, and she was the mother of a son, Alexander IV, who might have been his heir if Alexander had lived long enough. He was actually born after his father's death. Alexander then invaded India and advanced as far as the Hyphasis River before his army threatened to mutiny. The rumor of massive armies supported by thousands of war elephants, combined with The soldiers' fatigue and homesickness convinced Alexander to return to Persia and Babylon, where he consolidated his empire. Alexander valued the cultures that he had conquered, and he promoted the mixing of his subjects by holding mass weddings at Susa in 324 BCE, at which his officers were strongly encouraged to marry local women from prominent families. He died in 323 in Babylon, probably from illness, although poisoning was always rumored, and his empire fragmented. As I said, his son and heir was not yet born, and members of his group of close friends, called the Diadochi, began taking control of large regions. The most important of these were the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, and the Seleucid Empire in the east. Both would become centers of Hellenistic culture, and both would ultimately be absorbed into the Roman Empire in the 1st century BCE. The Seleucid, which extended all the way to the borders of India, also helped to enable the Silk Road. We've already discussed the beginnings of the Maurya Empire, just to the east of the territory that Alexander reached, and of Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism. Another important cultural development in India at this time was the composition, or at least the writing down, of what are still considered India's most important epic stories, the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana. Both were written in classical Sanskrit, and both gained wide followings through memorization and oral recitation. The Bhagavad Gita was written in a time of social ferment, when small kingdoms were being incorporated into the Mauryan Empire, and new traditions, like the Jains and the Buddhists, who we've already discussed, were engaging with the post-Vedic Hindus on issues of personal ethics and cosmic order. In the story, the god Krishna, who is an avatar of the high god Vishnu, instructs the warrior Arjuna, who is semi-divine himself, about duty, or dharma, and paths to liberation, or moksha. Arjuna must fight, despite his misgivings, and he's feeling uneasy because the enemies of his Pandava family are actually extended family themselves. But in any case, he has these misgivings about the war, and Krishna explains to him that he must fight on despite them, and also without attachment to the results. And this emphasizes the importance of selfless action, called karma yoga, devotion, called bhakti yoga, and knowledge, called jnana yoga, as paths to spiritual liberation. The Gita, as it's called, was probably an independent story, building on the themes of the Upanishads and all of this speculation about how these different traditions could fit together, before it was incorporated as Book 6 of the Indian national epic, the Mahabharata. So the Gita blends Upanishadic metaphysics with devotionalism and synthesizes all of these philosophical currents that are floating around in India at the time. Its impact was profound. Over 2,000 years after its writing, Gandhi called it his spiritual dictionary and his guide for nonviolent resistance. It shaped Hindu theology, art, and also global thought, influencing Western thinkers like Emerson and Hesse. Compared to Plato's dialogues, the Gita is a little bit less argumentative and a little bit more spiritual. But it's certainly in the same tradition of important philosophical writing. The Ramayana was also probably an ancient story that was gradually developed into an epic poem in Sanskrit before ultimately being written down. It's the story of Rama, a prince of the ancient kingdom of Ayodhya, and, incidentally, another avatar of Vishnu, although Rama is unaware of the fact throughout most of the story. When Ravana, the demon king of Lanka, or Sri Lanka, kidnaps Rama's wife Sita, the hero goes to war to get her back. Like the Gita, the story develops themes of dharma and bhakti and loyalty, and also a battle between good and evil. At the very end, when the hero and the villain are about to engage in single combat, Ravana reveals to Rama what the hero had not known, that Rama himself is an avatar, or an incarnation, of the high god Vishnu. Ravana says he never meant to and has not harmed Sita, but had only been trying to get Vishnu's attention. This paradox of defiance as worship surprises Rama, And because he actually is Vishnu, when he ultimately kills the demon, Ravana achieves moksha, or enlightenment, or release from the circle of karma and rebirth. The Ramayana's influence is vast. It inspired the holiday Diwali, Ramlila plays, and art all the way from Cambodia's Angkor Wat to Indian miniatures. Modern retellings have reframed the story for new audiences. The story's been brought to the screen countless times, and a television miniseries produced in the late 1980s is said to have been the most watched TV program in history. Compared to Homer's Odyssey, Rama's journey prioritizes dharma over glory, which reflects India's spiritual focus. Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism around 300 BCE in Athens. Born about 334 in Cyprus, Zeno was a wealthy Phoenician merchant who lost his entire fortune in a shipwreck. At the Stoa Poikile, which is a painted portico at the Athenian Agora, he taught that happiness, or eudaimonia, came from living virtuously in harmony with nature's rational order, called logos. External events such as wealth and pain and death were largely beyond a person's control and should be treated with indifference. Only wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance mattered. A person could never control what happened to them, only how they responded. Zeno saw the universe as a divine entity, with humans sharing in its rational spark. His Republic, written as a response to Plato's book of the same name, imagined a stateless community, and this shocked Athenian elites. Zeno's successors, Cleanthes and Chrysippus, refined Stoic logic and ethics. In a world of warring city-states, Stoicism offered apatheia, freedom from destructive passions that kind of echoed Buddhist ideas of non-attachment. You have power over your mind, not outside events, was an idea later echoed by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And today, Stoicism informs disciplines like modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Alexandria, Egypt, around 250 BCE, was a cosmopolitan hub where Greek philosophers, Jewish merchants, and Egyptian priests mingled under Ptolemaic rule. According to a possibly fictitious document called the Letter of Aristeas, Egypt's king Ptolemy III Philadelphus commissioned 72 Jewish scholars to translate the Torah into Greek for the Library of Alexandria. And this is the first mention in history of that famous library. It's more likely, though, that the process of translating the books of what the Christians call the Old Testament into Greek was gradual, driven by Hellenized Jews needing scriptures in Koine Greek, which was the Hellenistic dialect that Alexander had spread throughout the lands that he had conquered. The Septuagint, named for the 70 imagined scholars, included the Pentateuch, prophets, and apocryphal texts like Tobit and Maccabees. The translation made Judaism much more accessible to Gentiles, which enabled Philo of Alexandria to merge monotheism with Platonic and Stoic concepts, equating YHVH with the Logos. Early Christians would adopt this philosophy, leading ultimately to Christian Platonism. Although variations between the Septuagint and what's called the Masoretic text, which was revealed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, have sparked debates about textual accuracy, the Greek translation was a cultural bridge that broadened the faith's reach, while also subtly reshaping it. While the Greeks and the Phoenicians had been expanding across the Mediterranean, a city on the west-central coast of Italy was steadily growing in prominence. Founded, according to legend, in 753 BCE by orphan brothers Romulus and Remus, who had been raised by wolves, the early city was ruled by 7 kings, some of them legendary and some real. In 509 BCE, Rome ousted its last king and became a republic. The city was sacked by Gauls in 390 BCE, but it recovered and expanded. A Latin League helped to protect the city until 340 BCE, when Rome defeated its former allies and dissolved the alliance. Additional wars added to Rome's territory, and its policy of granting citizenship, although without voting rights, to conquered peoples helped to integrate its former foes. Rome borrowed military tactics and religion from the Greeks, and engineering from the Etruscans, which had developed to really new heights in Europe. Roman concrete, which was able even to set underwater, was so durable that concrete domes, such as the 71-foot Temple of Mercury at Baiae, which was built in the 1st century BCE, are still standing. In 264 BCE, Rome was a regional power. The Republican city controlled most of the Italian peninsula and a population of about 300,000. Carthage was a trade-based empire that spanned the Mediterranean. When a group of mercenaries seized the city of Messina in Sicily and asked both Rome and Carthage for help, Rome decided that the Carthaginian Empire had expanded quite far enough, thank you very much, into Italy, and that it needed to intervene. Carthage had the greatest navy in the Mediterranean, but when Rome was able to capture one of its ships intact, they reverse-engineered the quinquereme, which was named after its 5 rows of oars, and built 100 ships in 2 months. Rome then introduced the corvus, a boarding ship, which allowed them to fight sea battles much more like land battles, where they had the advantage. The sea war continued for nearly 20 years, with Rome winning several early victories, but ultimately failing to drive Carthage out of Sicily. In 241 BCE, though, Carthage agreed to a treaty that surrendered the island, which became Rome's first overseas province. Carthage also paid a heavy reparation, 3,200 talents of silver, and the Roman navy seized the islands of Corsica and Sardinia soon after. After the First Punic War's losses, Carthage rebuilt its power in Spain. While Rome was a rising power, Carthage still controlled most of the western Mediterranean. Their brilliant general Hannibal, raised during the previous war and hating Rome, besieged and sacked the Roman ally of Saguntum on the Iberian coast in 219 BCE. Rome declared war, and Hannibal launched a spectacular invasion in 218, crossing the Alps with 40,000 men and 37 war elephants. Reinforced by Gauls, his army defeated the Romans at Trebia in 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene in 217, and at Cannae in southern Italy in 216, where he encircled over 70,000 Romans and killed most of them in a single day. And this was the most stunning defeat that Rome had ever really undergone. And after these defeats, several of Rome's Italian allies made peace deals with the Carthaginians, who occupied much of Italy for over 13 years. Rome rebuilt its army really only with difficulty. It enrolled even slaves and criminals into legions that had previously been reserved for propertied elites. The defense of Italy was turned over to Fabius Maximus, who became known as Cunctator for his Fabian tactics of delaying head-to-head pitched battles, harassing Hannibal's supply lines, but successfully preventing him from conquering the capital. After the war had dragged on for nearly a decade in Italy, in 210 BCE, a young general who would be known as Scipio Africanus began attacking Carthage's Spanish bases. In 205 BCE, Scipio invaded Africa, causing Hannibal to be recalled by the Carthaginians and have to leave Italy to defend his home city. In the final battle at Zama in 202 BCE, an outnumbered Roman force defeated Hannibal's army with a brilliant cavalry outflank. Carthage surrendered Spain, surrendered its navy, and agreed not to fight wars outside Africa, or even within Africa without Rome's permission. And it promised to pay Rome 10,000 silver talents over the next 50 years. After the death of Alexander, the Jewish territory of Judea had fallen under the rule of the Seleucid kingdom. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who lived from about 215 to about 164 BCE, expanded his territory by conquering most of Egypt, which was ruled at this time by the descendants of another of the Diadochi, although he did leave a Ptolemy on the throne to appease the Romans, who were becoming a powerful force in regional politics. Judea lay between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. In 168 BCE, Possibly interpreting internal religious strife as a revolt, the king decided to Hellenize the region. He banned Jewish practices such as circumcision, the Sabbath, and kosher laws, and he installed a statue of Zeus in the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And of course, the addition of a Zeus statue in a temple dedicated to a monotheistic god, who had also specifically banned idolatry, was an outrage that spurred the chief priest and his sons to revolt. Led by Judas Maccabeus, the rebels used guerrilla tactics in Judea's hills. They won several victories, retaking Jerusalem in 164 BCE and rededicating the temple, which is an event that's celebrated with Hanukkah. Despite the stories in the Bible, the Seleucids were much less interested in crushing Judaism than the Maccabeans were in preserving it, and they had more pressing wars to attend to. So they eventually relented and unbanned Judaism. Judas Maccabeus died in 160 BCE, and the Seleucids reestablished direct control for a while. But their days as a kingdom were numbered. In 141 BCE, the son of the priest who had begun the revolt in the first place succeeded in expelling the Greeks from Jerusalem, and an alliance with the Roman Republic helped to guarantee their independence. One of the stipulations of that treaty that had ended the previous war between Rome and Carthage was that Carthage would fight no wars outside of Africa, and that it would not even go to war within Africa without the consent of Rome. Carthage's neighbor, Numidia, which by this time was bigger than Carthage itself, exploited this weakness by repeatedly invading and seizing territory. In 149 BCE, Carthage sent a force, a much less effective army than the ones they used to have, against Numidia, and it was actually defeated. After 2 generations of subjugation, Carthage was no longer really a threat to Rome. But Romans, such as the Roman senator Cato the Elder, who had fought in the Second Punic War, insisted Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Cato, who had been sent to Carthage in 157 BCE to arbitrate between the Carthaginians and the Numidians, saw the action that Carthage had taken as a pretext for a final war against Rome's Mediterranean rival. When a Roman fleet arrived at nearby Utica, the Carthaginians actually surrendered and turned over all of their weapons. The Romans besieged the city anyway, and Carthage managed to resist for 2 years and actually win a couple of battles. In the end, however, the Carthaginian army, which was outnumbered more than 2 to 1, failed, and Rome overran the city. Up to 750,000 Carthaginians were killed, and about 50,000 were sold into slavery. The destruction of the city was so complete that legends claimed that the Romans had sown the fields with salt to prevent crops from ever growing there again. Near the end of the Roman Republic, of course they didn't know that the Republic was going to end, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BCE, emerged as its greatest orator, weaving Greek philosophy into Roman life. The Catilinarian orations in 63 BC, which he delivered as a consul in the Senate, exposed Lucius Catiline's conspiracy to overthrow the government and rallied Rome against treason. These speeches blended logic, emotion, and theatrics, and saved the Republic temporarily. Cicero blended Greek ideas such as Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Platonism with Roman practicality. His De Officiis, written for his son or addressed to his son, distills Stoic ethics into duties of justice and public service. Cicero's letters reveal a man torn between ambition and principle. His death also reflects that tension. Cicero was proscribed, that is, put on a death list, by the Second Triumvirate and was beheaded in 43 BCE, his head being displayed on the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. That's called the rostra. And finally, Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar, who lived from 100 to 44 BCE, was born into a very influential patrician family in Rome. After defying the dictator Sulla in his youth, Caesar continued to distinguish himself as an orator and a political mover and shaker. His charisma and his strategic thinking allowed him to form an alliance with the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and with Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who we call Pompey, the man who had annexed Syria from Rome when the Seleucid kingdom finally collapsed in 64 BCE. The three men formed a ruling triumvirate, the first triumvirate, in 60 BCE. The Gallic Wars from 58 to 50 BCE transformed Rome and transformed Caesar's destiny. As governor of Gaul, Caesar launched campaigns to conquer what's now modern France and Belgium, and he described them all in Commentarii de Bello Gallico, which anybody who's ever studied Latin had to read as Caesar's Gallic Wars. It's a 7-book account that's part history and part propaganda, and of course portrays Caesar in the best possible light. His conquests added huge territories and wealth and loyal legions, and the Commentarii reveals Caesar's strategic mind. His conquests reshaped Roman politics, but also sparked civil war. When Caesar returned from Gaul, he famously crossed the Rubicon River, which meant he brought his legion into Italy proper, which was illegal. The Senate, backed by Pompey, Crassus had died in 53 BCE while Caesar was away, ordered Caesar in 50 to return to Rome as a private citizen rather than at the head of an army, to face charges of misconduct. Caesar chose to fight rather than submit. He attacked Pompey, who retreated to Greece, and that began a civil war that lasted until 45 BCE and resulted in Caesar taking control of the city of Rome and ultimately being named dictator for life. And this was a problem. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. Fearing his growing power, senators like Brutus and Cassius led the others, and Caesar was stabbed over 23 times. The act, which was meant to save the Republic, sparked yet another civil war and led to Octavian's rise, and the end of the Republic and the transition to empire. But we will talk about that next time. That's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.